Imagine living in a neighborhood where the very people meant to keep order are the ones twisting the rules to tear you down. One HOA board member, who everyone called Karen, decided that my family didn't belong. She didn't just file complaints or hand out fines. She went further. She called in so-called police to intimidate my wife right on our doorstep. But what she didn't know was that my wife had a secret that would turn the entire confrontation upside down. How do you think Karen reacted when the truth came out? When we first moved into the neighborhood, it felt like a dream. The streets were lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, the sidewalks were wide and clean, and the homes had that postcard look that made you believe everything inside those walls was just as perfect as the outside. For a while, it seemed like we had found exactly what we were looking for: peace, stability, and a community where we could put down roots. My wife and I wanted a place where we could focus on our careers, enjoy quiet evenings, and maybe even start a family. The HOA promised order, structure, and the kind of rules that would supposedly keep the neighborhood safe and beautiful. At first, that sounded reassuring. Who wouldn't want to live in a place where everyone respected the same standards? But beneath the freshly painted fences and manicured lawns, there was a tension most people didn't notice until it was too late. And at the center of it all was one board member, a woman everyone had nicknamed Karen. She wasn't officially the president of the HOA, but she acted like it. If someone's grass was half an inch too tall, she noticed. If a car was parked too close to the curb, she snapped a picture. And if a holiday decoration stayed up a day too long, she fired off an email. At first, her behavior seemed like garden variety pettiness. Annoying, yes, but harmless. But soon her eyes turned to us. Maybe it was because we were new. Maybe it was because my wife wasn't the type to nod politely and comply with every little rule. Or maybe Karen just needed someone to make an example out of. Whatever the reason, the small complaints started piling up faster than we could believe. A letter about the color of our mailbox, a warning about where we placed our trash can, a fine for a flower pot that wasn't approved. It was clear we had become her new project, her latest obsession. And as much as we tried to brush it off, each warning carried the weight of someone who was building a case, waiting for the right moment to strike harder. What Karen didn't realize, though, was that she had chosen the wrong family. Because behind my wife's quiet smile and polite replies was a strength, and a secret, that would eventually turn the entire neighborhood's perception upside down. But before that truth came to light, we would have to endure wave after wave of harassment, all carefully disguised as rule enforcement. And each step brought us closer to the moment when Karen's obsession crossed a line no one could have imagined. At first, the fines seemed almost laughable. $25 here, $50 there. A mailbox flag that didn't meet community standards. A trash bin that wasn't pulled in fast enough. It was frustrating, yes, but we figured it was just part of living in an HOA-controlled neighborhood. You pay to live in a community like this. You deal with the rules and you move on. At least, that's what we told ourselves in those early days. But it wasn't long before the pettiness transformed into something darker. The letters didn't stop, they multiplied. Each envelope in the mailbox felt like a warning shot, a reminder that someone was watching our every move, and the signature at the bottom of every notice, the same one. Karen's, it wasn't just the paperwork, either. We noticed her car parked at odd hours across the street, sitting there, engine idling, as if she were documenting our lives through the safety of a windshield. More than once, I caught her taking photos of our front yard, snapping away with a phone like she was building evidence for a trial that only existed in her mind. The HOA rules became her weapon, and she wielded them with surgical precision. One week, it was our flower pots being non-compliant. The next, our lawn chairs violated community harmony. Each violation came with a fine, and each fine came with a deadline. It was a slow drip of control designed to wear us down. And to make matters worse, she wasn't just enforcing the rules, she was twisting them. Take the parking issue. Our driveway could comfortably fit 2 cars, but Karen argued that one of them extended too close to the sidewalk. She threatened us with fines unless we parked in the visitor lot down the street. It didn't matter that other neighbors did the same thing. Karen had chosen her target, and she wasn't letting go. We tried reasoning with the HOA board, but every meeting felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict was already decided. Karen's voice carried more weight than anyone else's. She presented her photos, her reports, her stack of carefully organized complaints. And while some board members looked uncomfortable, no one dared to challenge her outright. Not yet. The breaking point came when she accused us of disrupting the community aesthetic. because of a simple garden project. My wife had planted a row of flowers along the walkway. Nothing outlandish, just a burst of color to brighten our yard. But Karen claimed they violated the HOA landscaping policy. Within days, we received a fine and an order to remove them. It was infuriating. Every attempt to make our house feel like a home was met with resistance. Every gesture of normal life was turned into a crime, and yet, through all of it, my wife remained calm. She never raised her voice, never snapped back, never gave Karen the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. At the time, I couldn't understand how she stayed so composed. Looking back, I realize it was because she'd faced far worse than a power-hungry HOA bully. But Karen mistook that composure for weakness. She thought she was winning, and when people like her feel powerful, they push further. Soon it wasn't just fines, it was harassment. Anonymous notes left on our doorstep. Cars slowing down in front of our house late at night. HOA volunteers showing up unannounced to inspect our property. One afternoon, we even found our trash can knocked over, its contents scattered across the street, and Karen just happened to be there, standing with her arms crossed, watching as we cleaned up. The tension in the neighborhood grew too. Neighbors who once waved politely started keeping their distance. Some whispered that Karen was spreading rumors, painting us as rule breakers, who thought we were above the community's standards. She was isolating us, making sure we were seen as outsiders in a place we had once called home. It all came to a head when the HOA introduced a new rule that seemed almost tailor-made to target us. Overnight, they announced a policy requiring all outdoor furniture to be pre-approved by the board. No one else in the neighborhood had ever been cited for their chairs or benches, yet within a week, we received a notice claiming ours didn't meet the guidelines. The fine was higher this time, the language sharper. It was clear Karen was escalating, and then came the so-called safety checks. Karen began reporting us to the HOA for supposed suspicious activity. She claimed we had strange visitors, that we were keeping odd hours, that our home was a potential concern for the community. It was absurd, but the accusations carried weight. Suddenly, board members were showing up at our door, clipboard in hand, asking intrusive questions. Each incident chipped away at our patience, but more importantly, it revealed just how far Karen was willing to go. She wasn't satisfied with fines or rules. She wanted to intimidate us. She wanted to drive us out, and she nearly succeeded, until she made her boldest move yet. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the rooftops, we saw flashing lights outside our home. Two men in dark uniforms stepped out of an unmarked car, badges clipped to their belts. They introduced themselves as officers conducting an investigation. At first glance, they looked legitimate. But something about them was off. The lack of squad numbers, the absence of a marked patrol car, the vague answers they gave when asked why they were there. They claimed they were responding to a call from the HOA about ongoing disturbances at our residence. My stomach sank. This was Karen's doing. She had escalated her campaign from fines and harassment to something far more sinister, fake police intimidation. The men started asking questions, too personal, too invasive. They wanted details about my wife, about her schedule, about what she did for work. Their tone wasn't professional, it was threatening. It was clear their goal wasn't to protect the neighborhood, but to unsettle us, to make us feel small and vulnerable. For a moment I felt exactly that, helpless, standing on my own doorstep, facing men who held themselves like authorities even if they weren't. My wife, though, didn't flinch. She watched them carefully, her expression unreadable, as if she were analyzing every move, every word. And then, with a calmness that chilled me to my core, she stepped forward. Karen had overplayed her hand. She thought she was dealing with an ordinary neighbor, someone she could bully into submission. But she had no idea who she was really dealing with, or the storm she had just unleashed. The fake cops had crossed the line, but what happened next didn't just expose Karen's scheme, it revealed a secret my wife had kept hidden for years. And once that secret came out, nothing in the neighborhood would ever be the same again. The two men stood on our doorstep, badges flashing in the dim porchlight, their presence heavy and unsettling. Their voices carried the false authority of people used to getting away with intimidation. They wanted information, they wanted compliance, and most of all, they wanted fear, and for a moment they had it. My chest tightened as I realized the scope of what Karen had done. This wasn't just fines or letters. She had actually gone out of her way to enlist imposters, parading them as police officers, all to put us in our place. It was harassment turned into a dangerous charade. But while I wrestled with disbelief, my wife stood completely still, her eyes locked on the two men with a calm intensity that I had never seen before. It wasn't fear, it was calculation. She didn't interrupt them, didn't argue, didn't shout. She simply watched, waiting for the exact moment when their act would unravel. They asked again about her work, pressing for details that had nothing to do with community rules or disturbances. They pushed for her ID, her schedule, even her travel history. Their tone grew more aggressive, their patience shorter, as if they believed intimidation alone would break her down. And then, with an icy steadiness, she asked them a single question. "Which precinct are you with?" The two exchanged a glance, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. They didn't have an answer ready. One mumbled something about a regional unit. The other stumbled over his words entirely. And that was when my wife made her move. She reached into her purse, not with hesitation, but with practiced confidence, and produced her own badge, not a flimsy imitation clipped to a belt, not a cheaply printed card, a government-issued credential that carried more authority than either of those men could have ever imagined. The silence that followed was deafening. Their posturing collapsed instantly. The fake authority they had been clinging to disintegrated under the weight of the truth staring them in the face. My wife wasn't just some homeowner fighting against HOA harassment. She was a federal agent, trained, credentialed, and very aware of the laws they had just broken by impersonating officers. I will never forget the look on their faces. The bravado drained away, leaving only panic. Their eyes darted from her badge to each other, scrambling for an excuse, a way out. But there was none. In that instant the power shifted completely. They were no longer the predators, they were the prey. My wife's voice didn't rise above a steady, measured tone as she explained in detail the federal penalties for impersonating law enforcement. She described the charges they could face, the prison time, the irreversible consequences of what they had just attempted. And she didn't stop there. She told them, calmly, precisely, that their names, their faces, their entire operation would now be reported directly to the proper authorities. The men froze. They knew they were finished. One of them stammered an apology. The other tried to claim it was a misunderstanding. But it was too late. The game was over, and they had lost in the most spectacular way possible. And then, almost as if summoned by fate, Karen herself appeared. She had been standing nearby, lurking in the shadows to watch her plan unfold. When she saw what was happening, she stepped forward, her usual smug expression plastered on her face. But that expression faltered the moment she realized what she was walking into. My wife turned toward her, badge still in hand, and explained, in front of everyone, the seriousness of the situation. She didn't yell, didn't accuse. She simply laid out the facts. Karen had conspired in an act of harassment that involved criminal impersonation of law enforcement officers. What she thought would be her ultimate show of power had now transformed into undeniable evidence of her abuse. The color drained from Karen's face. She tried to backpedal, insisting she didn't know they weren't real officers, that she was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. But the damage was done. Neighbors had gathered by then, drawn out of their homes by the flashing lights and raised voices. They witnessed everything. The fake cops caught in their lie, my wife standing tall with her badge, and Karen stumbling over excuses that sounded weaker with every word. For years, Karen had ruled the neighborhood through fear, gossip, and relentless intimidation. But in that moment, her empire crumbled in front of the very people she had sought to control. Her credibility shattered. Her reputation exposed for what it really was, a mask hiding insecurity, obsession, and a hunger for power she never truly had. The fake officers, desperate to escape, tried to retreat, but my wife made it clear they wouldn't get far. Calls were already being placed. Reports were already being filed. And as for Karen, her name would be attached to this fiasco forever. No amount of denial could erase what the neighborhood had just witnessed. The confrontation ended not with shouting, but with silence. A heavy, stunned silence that said more than any argument ever could. For the first time, Karen had no control. She couldn't spin the story, couldn't twist the rules, couldn't hide behind the HOA board. She had been exposed in the most public, humiliating way possible. And as my wife turned, her badge glinting under the streetlight, she looked at Karen with the same calm expression she'd worn all along. Not anger, not gloating, just certainty. Certainty that justice was no longer a vague hope, but a reality already set into motion. That night marked the peak of everything. The harassment, the intimidation, the endless games Karen had played. She had pushed too far, and in doing so, She triggered the one outcome she had never expected: total exposure. The neighborhood watched died as the queen of petty power plays was finally stripped of her throne. The night of the confrontation didn't just end with the fake officers slinking away in disgrace and Karen standing speechless under the streetlights. That moment was only the spark. What followed was a wildfire that spread through the entire neighborhood and, eventually, the HOA itself. For years, Karen had been untouchable. She thrived in the shadows of rulebooks, policies, and whispered rumors. She had always relied on the fear that no one would stand up to her. But after that night, fear no longer protected her. She was exposed, and the community could never look at her the same way again. The next morning, word spread like electricity. People who had been asleep during the confrontation woke up to buzzing group chats, email threads, and hushed conversations at mailboxes. Those who had been there the night before told their stories in vivid detail. How 2 fake cops were caught lying, how my wife revealed her CA credentials, and how Karen was left fumbling for excuses in front of everyone. It didn't take long for the narrative to solidify. Karen had crossed a line no one could ignore. By midweek, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. The air in that room was thick, charged with a mixture of anger, shame, and anticipation. Dozens of neighbors showed up, far more than the usual handful who bothered to attend. People who had once stayed silent now spoke openly, emboldened by what they had seen. They shared their own stories, how Karen had threatened them, manipulated rules, and twisted fines to suit her personal vendettas. One by one, the tales painted a clear picture. Karen's abuse of power wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, and now, with her most reckless stunt exposed, the HOA could no longer hide behind her. The board members who had once tolerated her control sat stiffly at the table, their expressions pale. For the first time, they couldn't defend her. They couldn't spin her actions as misunderstandings or overzealous enforcement. The evidence was undeniable, the humiliation too public. The community's patience had evaporated. And then came the decisive blow. My wife herself stepped forward. She didn't reveal every detail of her background. She never does. But she made it clear that impersonating law enforcement wasn't just a neighborhood dispute. It was a federal matter. She had already filed a report, and investigations were underway. Her calm, authoritative tone silenced the room. No one dared to question her. Karen, sitting in the corner, tried to interrupt, tried to plead, but her voice was drowned out by the murmurs of neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak. For the first time, she was powerless in the very space she had once dominated. The board voted that night to remove her from her position. It wasn't unanimous. She still had 1 or 2 loyal supporters, but the majority had finally turned against her. The weight of public opinion was too heavy, the evidence too damning. Karen was finished, but the fallout didn't stop there. The investigation into the fake officers revealed just how far Karen had gone. She hadn't simply called the wrong people, as she tried to claim. She had knowingly contacted individuals who posed as police, arranging for them to confront us under the guise of keeping order. Their connections, their history, their intent, it all pointed back to her. And while she managed to avoid the harshest charges by cooperating, she couldn't escape the consequences entirely. She faced fines, legal scrutiny, and the permanent stain of being known as the woman who tried to weaponize fake law enforcement against her own neighbors. For someone like Karen, reputation was everything, and now she had none. In the weeks that followed, the transformation in the neighborhood was almost surreal. The same people who had once avoided eye contact began stopping by our house to apologize, to share their own frustrations, to admit that they had been too afraid to stand up before. They weren't just being friendly, they were acknowledging the truth. Karen had terrorized the community for too long, and her reign was finally over. The HOA itself changed too. With Karen gone, the board restructured its rules, revising policies that had been weaponized under her watch. The ridiculous fines, the vague guidelines, the invasive inspections, all of it was reevaluated. For the first time, the HOA actually listened to the residents it was supposed to serve. It wasn't perfect HOA, rarely are, but it was no longer the dictatorship it had once been. And as for Karen, she faded from the neighborhood. The woman who once strutted through community meetings with an air of untouchable authority now kept her head down. Her once proud car, often parked strategically to monitor others, was seen less and less. Eventually, whispers spread that she had put her house on the market. Whether it was out of shame, pressure, or simply the realization that she could never reclaim her former status. It didn't matter. The chapter was closing, but the impact of that night reached deeper than Karen's downfall. It reshaped the way we, and our neighbors, viewed community, power, and resilience. For me, it was a lesson in how fragile peace can feel when someone decides to abuse authority. A neighborhood that had once seemed picture perfect had hidden cracks all along, and it took one person's obsession to reveal just how deep they ran. Living under constant scrutiny, dealing with endless fines, being targeted day after day, it would have been easy to give in, to pack up and leave. Many people do, but my wife showed me something else, the power of patience, composure, and quiet strength. She never gave Karen the outburst she wanted, never lowered herself to the level of petty arguments. She waited, she observed, and when the time was right, she struck with truth, not rage. And that truth was more powerful than any rulebook or intimidation tactic ever could be. For the community, it was a reckoning. People realized how dangerous silence can be, how easily power can corrupt when no one speaks up. Karen had thrived because she convinced everyone she couldn't be challenged. Once she was exposed, that illusion shattered. And suddenly, the neighbors who had once whispered behind curtains were standing together, no longer afraid. In the end, it wasn't just about us. It was about everyone who had endured her reign of control. The night the fake cops showed up didn't just reveal my wife's secret. It revealed Karen's too. It showed that her authority was nothing more than smoke and mirrors built on fear and manipulation. The takeaway: bullies, whether in an HOA, a workplace, or anywhere else, only have as much power as we let them. Once someone stands up, once the truth is dragged into the light, the illusion collapses. To this day, whenever I walk down those manicured sidewalks or see the freshly trimmed hedges, I can't help but think of how close we came to losing it all, to being driven out by one woman's obsession. But instead of defeat, we found something stronger: resilience, justice, and a neighborhood that finally learned what community really means. And Karen, she became a cautionary tale. Her name no longer carried weight, only whispers. She went from being the enforcer of the rules to the punchline of conversations, the example parents used when telling their kids what happens when you take things too far. It's ironic, really. She wanted control. She wanted power. She wanted to be remembered as the woman who kept the neighborhood in line. And in a way, she is remembered, but not how she ever intended. Because in the end, Karen didn't just lose her position or her reputation. She lost the one thing she valued most: fear. No one feared her anymore. No one cared about her approval. And that, more than anything else, was her true downfall. So if you take anything away from this story, let it be this: power built on fear is fragile. It shatters the moment truth steps in, and when it does, the people who seemed untouchable are revealed for what they always were: just people, flawed and fallible, who crumble when their lies are exposed. The night Karen sent fake cops to our door, she thought she was writing the final chapter of our time in that neighborhood. But what she really did was write her own ending. And it wasn't one of triumph. It was one of humiliation, exposure, and defeat. And I'll leave you with this: if someone in your life is playing the role of Karen, an HOA bully, a neighbor with too much time on their hands, or anyone who abuses a sliver of authority, what would happen if, instead of breaking under their pressure, you simply held your ground and waited for the moment when their own lies brought them down? Because sooner or later, they always do.